we begin, if everyone can please just read within the chat box for any of the housekeeping so far. But again, good morning and afternoon, everyone. We're so delighted that you were able to join us today. And thank you for joining us on this webinar hosted by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or the SBTi for short. We will outline the upcoming changes to the SBTi criteria and the implications for SBTi companies. My name is McKenna Smith, and I am a science-based target analyst with WWF France, and I will be moderating today's session. Right, so before we get started, I would like to address a few housekeeping items. First of all, the webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared with all of you. If you have any questions to the presenters, please submit them using the Q&A function on your Zoom window. Our team will be answering these questions in writing throughout the next hour, and we will also directly address questions during the last 15 minutes of the webinar that we think pertain to the wider audience. As noted, the chat function is disabled for everyone, so if you do have a question about a technical issue you're encountering, please also enter that in the Q&A box. We also encourage you to use the speaker function throughout the webinar to see both the slides as well as the speaker on your screen. Okay, so I would like to introduce today's speakers. Today, you will hear from Alberto Carrillo, who is the Managing Director and co-founder of the SBTi from CDP. Also, we have Leah Fink, the European Regional Lead for Commit to Action, also at CDP. And as mentioned, I will be moderating today's session. Right, so in this session, we'll begin to explain the recent announcement made by the SBTi regarding our plan to increase minimum ambition in corporate target setting to 1.5C. Specifically, we will talk through, Alberto will briefly speak about an introduction to the SBTi, setting the scene for today's webinar. He will then explain the rationale behind the SBTi's decision to ratchet up ambition to 1.5C. Leah will then delve into the key changes to the SBTi criteria, which will come into force in July 2022, and will outline the implications of these changes for companies which are already a part of the SBTi. Looking ahead, she will also walk through the key SBTi milestones for the remainder of 2021. Finally, I will lead us into a live Q&A session, but keep in mind Q&A will be also answered in written format throughout the webinar. As mentioned again, if you have questions to the presenters, please submit them using that Q&A function on your Zoom window, and also indicate if you have a specific speaker that you would like the question to be directed to. We will be answering questions at the very end and also in writing. So I am now really happy to hand over to the SBTi's Managing Director, Alberto, who will provide a brief introduction to the Science-Based Targets Initiative and explain why the initiative is raising the minimum level of ambition to 1.5C. Alberto, over to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, McKenna, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We are very pleased to have you in this call. And I want to start with a brief introduction to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. For those of you who are not very familiar with the initiative started in 2015 as a collaboration between 4 organizations: CDP, UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. And we've been working since the beginning with the Win Business Coalition. And our aim is to drive ambition in the corporate sector through the adoption and implementation of climate targets that are based on science. That's the core of what we do. Next slide, please. And today we have over 1,700 companies that are in the journey of setting and implementing science-based targets. About half of these companies have already gone through the process of setting their targets, and now they are in the implementation phase. And then about half of the companies are in the target setting phase. A couple of years ago, when the IPCC released their previous report, we launched the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign that is basically incentivizing companies to align to the highest ambition, 1.5 degree. And since then, we have now over 700 companies that are in the process of aligning to 1.5 degrees. And I'm going to get back to this point. Then next slide, please. Um, we released our latest progress report at the beginning of this year, and one of the highlights of the report is that we started assessing how companies are decarbonizing over the past few years and whether this is consistent with the ambition of their targets. And one of the highlights was that companies are actually reducing their emissions at a rate that exceeds the rate that is needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And in average, companies with science-based targets reduce their emissions by 25% between 2015 and 2020. And that is in contrast with the increase in emissions that we experience at the global level. And so we are seeing that science-based targets works, that companies that go through the science-based target setting process actually embrace a decarbonization strategy and decarbonization trajectory. And now what we want to see is, first of all, to land on the right ambition to respond to the climate urgency, and second of all, to scale up the number of companies setting science-based targets. Next slide, please. Great. Now, a few weeks ago, we released our new strategy, our 2025 strategy, science-based targets, and these two components that I just mentioned, scaling up action consistent with 1.5 degrees, and basically mainstreaming the adoption of science-based targets are at the core of our new strategy. And I want to walk you through the process that we have followed to define ambition in the SBTi. If you go to the next slide, please. To start with, it's important to highlight that the Science-Based Targets Initiative started just after the release of the fifth assessment report of the IPCC that was released in 2013, 2014. And the focus of that report was around 2 degrees. And based on that ambition, that was basically the standard for climate action at the time, the Science-Based Targets Initiative started with the focus of driving targets that are consistent with limiting warming to 2 degrees. That's what the world knew back then. And then, of course, this was before the Paris Agreement was adopted. The Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. And then we started talking about well below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, but it was still a concept that was, I would say, relatively unclear in the climate action space. And we got the clarity that we needed, first of all, in terms of the urgency to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, but also in terms of the transformation that is needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees with the release of the special report to 1.5 degrees that the IPCC released at the end of 2018. This report was really a breakthrough in terms of the clarity that was needed to inform climate action for state and non-state actors. And based on that report, basically the SBTi started a process to ratchet up ambition. We started first with raising the minimum ambition in the initiative from 2 degrees to well below 2 degrees. And at the time, we introduced the business ambition for 1.5 degree campaign that I mentioned. We started with a small number of companies that were committed to align to 1.5 degrees. At the time, we had 28 companies. As I mentioned, today we have over 700 companies. And we also started the process to inform how net zero target setting looks like when it is done through the lens of climate science. And we are actually in the process of finalizing and releasing the net zero standard at the end of this year. And this is, of course, a key component of business ambition for 1.5 degrees. And so this has been an evolution that the Science-Based Targets Initiative has gone through. Now, of course, we are in the middle of the sixth assessment report of the IPCC that in many ways confirms what we already knew from the from the special report to 1.5 degrees, and also brings more clarity on the urgency. The fact that we are actually already experiencing more severe impacts of what we had considered before. And this brings the sense of urgency that is needed to actually embrace a transformation that is consistent with 1.5 degrees. Next slide, please. Now, the good news is that companies in the Science Based Targets Initiative and many of you that are joining us today have already embraced the sense of urgency. Over the past 12 months, over 2/3 of the targets that the Science Based Targets Initiative has approved are already 1.5 degree aligned. 1.5 degree has already become the most common ambition in the SBTi. This, of course, this gives us great confidence in terms of the level of ambition that is feasible today in the corporate sector. And also, as I mentioned, the number of companies aligning to 1.5 degree through business ambition for 1.5 degrees grew in these 2 years from less than 30 companies to over 700 companies. And we are really seeing exponential growth in companies embracing ambitious climate action. Next slide, please. And so based on this, we decided to embrace 1.5 degree as a central part of our strategy and basically, responding to the urgency that we are experiencing and the need to scale up action that is consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. We decided to take another step in raising ambition in the SBTi and to ratchet up from well below 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. And based on this new strategy that was unveiled on the 15th of July of 2021, we started basically a grace period and a deadline for targets that are not 1.5 degree aligned. And based on this, basically the last day when the SBTi will be validating targets that are 1.5 degree aligned will be on the 15th of July of 2022. And of course, what we want to share with you now is how this is going to work in practice and how companies that are in different stages of their target setting cycle will be impacted by this upgrade of ambition. Thank you very much. I hand over back to McKenna.
That's great. Thanks, Alberto. And up next speaking is Leah, who is the Global Manager on the Corporate Engagement team. Leah, handing over to you.
Thank you, McKenna, and hello, everyone. Very happy to be here with you today. So now that we heard from Alberto about the context of the new SBTi strategy and the historic background of why we're doing what we're doing, I will spend quite a bit of time giving you an overview of the upcoming criteria changes, and then very importantly, speaking about the implications that these criteria changes are having depending on the specific point that you are on your science-based targets journey. And specifically as well for those companies that have already joined the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign that Alberto already briefly spoke about. All right, so before I would like to, oops, that was slightly too quick, yeah. So before I would like to go into the criteria updates in more detail, I would like to spend a few minutes contextualizing this criteria update. So as I'm sure most of you know, science-based targets are science-based emission reduction targets, right? They're following what most recent climate science tells us is necessary, and we know what is necessary is to globally achieve the 1.5 degree goal, as Alberto already laid out. And in order to do that, we need to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest, and crucially, half emissions by 2030 in order to have a realistic chance to actually get there. So this is a journey, right? And it is on a global level as well as on a corporate level. So we're categorizing the science-based emission reduction trajectory into near-term science-based targets and long-term science-based targets now. So when we look at near-term science-based targets, this is what we've been doing for the past 5 years, short to medium time frame emission reduction targets, what we've always referred to as science-based targets, SBTs. And this is what we're speaking about today. So the criteria version 5 that we have, that we will launch later on this year, and that we've announced in this strategy launch on last month, 4 weeks ago, is a change to the framework for near-term science-based target setting. So we have near-term science-based targets, and then we have long-term science-based targets, which is new, and these are net zero targets, right? So while near-term targets define how quickly and how much there is to reduce to be on track to achieve these long-term goals, these long-term net zero science-based targets define the end state, essentially. So as Alberto laid out, in 2019, the SBTi started an inclusive stakeholder-based process to develop the first science-based approach to corporate net zero target setting. This framework, which includes guidance and specific criteria for this long-term net zero target setting process, is close to be finalized. So we already have the draft resources available on our website, and we're currently road testing them with around 80 companies. And then we're going to go into a second round of public consultation soon. And then we launched the framework with the net zero criteria and all of that ahead of COP26. So we already, even though this framework is not fully finalized and published yet, we already know what a robust net zero strategy looks like. And we know that both robust near-term targets as well as that end state are crucial elements. So what we're expecting companies to do is essentially, quite simply put, reducing as many emissions as possible, and to have robust interim science-based targets that make sure that the necessary level of immediate climate action is being taken by companies and financial institutions. And then that also the long-term direction of travel is clear, right? That every company is setting themselves on a path to actually achieving net zero by 2050 and is working towards a minimum or zero emissions or minimum level of residual emissions that are then being neutralized to reach the state of net zero. So in the end, we have these, like a net zero strategy entails both. So of course, near-term science-based targets and long-term net zero targets are very closely interlinked. And this is very important for you to know for context. However, I just want to note again that today we are not focusing on this net zero framework and on the upcoming criteria for the net zero target setting, as we will have dedicated sessions for that. And also, if you do want to learn more, you can visit our net zero landing page on sciencebasedtargets.org and sign up to the mailing list. And of course, it would be great to have many of you participating in our next round of public consultations as well. And we will start validating net zero targets from January 2022 onwards. But for now, let's not get confused with these different categories and dive into the changes to the near-term science-based targets with the upcoming version 5 of the SBTi criteria. So we've already heard, so on June 15th, we gave a big heads up to our stakeholders, to the companies that are already on the journey, that this is coming, right? And we deliberately did that now, so that actually everyone has the time to plan accordingly, companies that are already in the process. And of course, we're acknowledging that the target setting process, as individual as it can be, can also take quite a while. Internal approval can take a while. And of course, we don't want this to come as a major disruption. So we've basically published what is about to come for people to be able to plan accordingly. But as we already heard, the actual criteria version 5 are not yet launched. They will be launched at the end of the year, and they will come into force from July 22 onwards. So what are we presenting today are the headline changes, what we already know, what we want everyone to know. So please don't treat this as a comprehensive list. We're still going through our regular criteria assessment and update process. So of course, there might be more minor changes that will also be included in this criteria update. But for now, let's focus on these headline changes. of course, most importantly, we are following what science tells us is necessary, and we are increasing the minimum level of ambition, both for scope 1 and 2 targets, as well as for scope 3 targets. So for scope 1 and 2 targets, we're increasing the minimum level of ambition from well below 2-degree alignment to 1.5-degree alignment. And we're slowly phasing out 2-degree and well below 2-degree targets over the next few years, of course, strongly incentivizing to align with a 1.5-degree scenario as quickly as possible. On scope 3, we are increasing the minimum level of ambition from 2-degree to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And that is, of course, also a very important element, as scope 3 emissions are for most companies significantly higher than for scope 1 and 2, and scope 3 emissions still yield gigantic emission reduction potential as well. And we still want to increase the level of accountability and incentivize short-term action as well on scope 3 reductions. The third headline change here is the time frame. We're shortening the time frame of near-term science-based targets from 5 to 15 years to 5 to 10 years from the date of target submission. So now let's get into the implications. We've already received quite many questions from many of you in advance. And of course, every company wants to assess where do they stand, what does that mean? And one very common scenario, of course, is we have approved 2-degree or well below 2-degree targets. When are we obliged to update them? Here, we would like to direct you to an existing SBT criterion, which is C23, which we introduced in 2019 to ensure consistency with the most recent climate science. And we've actually been asking companies since then to review and, if necessary, revalidate their targets every 5 years. Because of that criteria update in 2019, there is a difference if these targets have been approved in 2020 or earlier, which means that companies have until 2025 to update their targets to be in line with the latest SBTi criteria. And then we have companies that have had their targets approved after that, which means in 2021, so these past few months, and they have to comply with that criteria as usual and review and, if necessary, revalidate their targets every 5 years. Again, we have been and we will keep on incentivizing the most ambitious target setting and regular updates across all companies. All right, so with this table, this is basically just summarizing again the headline changes and the different timelines to really make clear what's the difference between the current criteria, the upcoming criteria, and which implications that has if you are right now in the target development process, if you don't have targets yet and you just want to understand what you can do when. So this should be helpful. So if we look at the first column here, we have criteria version 4.2, the current criteria, which will remain valid until July 14th, 2022. And there, the minimum level of ambition is well below 2-degree targets for scope 1 and 2, and for scope 3, 2-degree and 2-degree alignment. And for the criteria version 5, as just said, the new minimum level of ambition for scope 1 and 2 will be 1.5, for scope 3 will be well below 2-degree. And if we look at the time frame, again, this will be shortened from 5 to 15 years to 5 to 10 years. Another very important SBT criterion is our boundary criterion. And here we are not making changes to the criteria for near-term science-based target setting. So companies need to cover 95% of their scope 1 and 2 emissions and 2/3, so a minimum of 67% of their scope 3 emissions. This does not change. But coming back to the timeline, as I said, current criteria will remain valid until the new ones will come into force. So from July 15th onwards, targets have to be aligned with the new criteria. But we're actually launching them in December, which means we have this grace period of a few months where both criteria versions will be available. We've done the same with the last large criteria update. That this is just to, again, give companies the chance of some planning security and, of course, flexibility needed. However, with the strong encouragement to use version 5 where possible. All right, so I hope that made things clearer. And now I would like to dive into the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign, which we already heard from Alberto. We launched in 2019 with a very strong call to action to the corporate sector to commit to align their business with 1.5 degree future, but also to create a group of leading companies to have an aggregated voice for 1.5 degree aligned policy making, to create more enabling policy environments, and of course to also use that strong voice for calling for updated national climate targets. And this will be and is being a flagship leadership campaign in the corporate sector leading up to COP26 and at COP26. This is an official partner to the Race to Zero. So companies that are joining the campaign are already part of the Race to Zero as well. And many of you today are already part of the initiative, which is fantastic, and part of the campaign. If you are not already, we would of course also like to take this opportunity today to encourage you to sign up ahead of COP26. We actually have a cutoff date on September 30th to include companies in all our profiling communications around COP26, and to really make sure that we're leveraging this fantastic group of leading companies accordingly at COP26. So if you haven't already, we invite you to visit our website and assess whether you could sign up before September 30th. As a reminder, and I'm also showing this because afterwards I will go into each of the different options to basically explain the implications for your company, depending whether you've already joined option 1, option 2, or both options. So in order to join this leadership campaign, companies sign the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree commitment letter, and there are 2 options. And if you think back of the graph that I showed you in the beginning with the near term and the long term science-based targets, so basically near term, interim science-based targets, and then the longer term net zero targets, this commitment letter is combining the 2. Option 1 is only focusing on the near term part. Option 2 is combining near term and long term. And by taking both options, which is what we're encouraging companies to do, companies are committing to the highest level of ambition. So very quickly, option 1 is the commitment to set very steep near-term SBTs, 1.5 degree alignment across all scopes, which means also 1.5 degree alignment for scope 3 targets if the company needs to set a scope 3 target, which the SBTi is obliging them to if the scope 3 emissions are more than 40% of their overall emissions. So if scope 3 is significant, a scope 3 target needs to be set, and it needs to be also be aligned with a 1.5 emission scenario. And for option 2, we have 2 different elements here. One is interim science-based targets across all scopes, and the second is to set a long-term net zero target that is aligned with our upcoming framework for net zero target setting. As I said, we will start validating them in January 2022. And this is the commitment to set net zero targets based on this framework that we will be launching within 2 years from that. So every company that has committed to set net zero targets under this campaign will have basically until January 2024. So 2 years after we start validating these targets to submit net zero targets and get them approved. But I hope that will also get clearer in case it's not already on the next slides. So now I would like to or before I go into the options, would like to shortly remind you of the different timelines, acknowledging this might not be relevant to all of you. So I will go through this relatively quickly, but again, we will be sharing the slides with all of you. You'll also find this information in our FAQs. And if anything is unclear, you can always also get in touch with us. So for companies that have joined the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign, for the first time. So they joined the SBTi through the campaign. They have 24 months to get their targets approved and to align with their business ambition for 1.5 degree commitment, same as through the standard route that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with as well. If a company already had a commitment through the standard route and basically on top of that committed to business ambition, so it's essentially they committed, to an upgrade of their commitment, they have until the end of the existing commitment period and can request a 12-month extension if necessary. And for companies that already had an approved SBT and then joined the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign on top of that, they have 12 months to adjust their current SBTs and make sure that they are aligned with what they have committed to. And please note that same as for all of our companies that are participating companies, we are following our protocol of expired commitment. So if a company fails to comply with this commitment within these timeframes, we are removing the commitment depending on whether there's already a target in place or if there's no target set yet, to remove the company's name from the website. So I would also just like to use the chance today as a reminder, if you have committed, please make sure to find out what's your company specific deadline and make sure to comply with it. And we've also sent out some individual company cases, emails. If anything remains unclear, please get in touch with us and assess the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign FAQ document. That should also be very helpful in terms of defining these timelines. All right, let's now get into the different company cases. So if your company has chosen option 1, the most important thing to note is that this criteria update that we're speaking about today has no major implications, because looking back on what you committed to, you committed to have 1.5 degree aligned SBTs across all scopes, which means you're already aligned with what will become mandatory, right? So there's no major implications, even though, of course, there's still other differences as well between the criteria sets. But I would still shortly walk you through these different scenarios, but not spend too much time. So again, we'll share the slides with you. All right, so do you have approved SBTs already and are signed up for option 1? If yes, the question is, are they already aligned with 1.5 degree scenarios across all scopes? If they are, fantastic, you're compliant with your commitment. If they are not, you have, because you've already had approved SBTs that need to be updated, you have the 12 months from your commitment onwards to update your targets. If you don't have targets yet, you do have that full 24 months to get your targets approved, and they must be aligned with what you committed to, which was a 1.5 degree alignment across all scopes. Let's now get to option 2. Again, the question is here, do you have approved SBTs already? If yes, the question is, have they been approved before 2020 or after? Coming back to the different time frames I showed you earlier. If they have been approved in 2020 or before, you have to update your targets by 2025 at the latest. Again, we encourage an early alignment if possible. If they have been approved afterwards, which now means in 2021, you have 5 years from your approval to update the target. So that will be at some point in 2026, respectively. If you don't have targets yet, you need interim science-based targets and you don't have them in place yet. So you will have to submit them at some point soon. And here it depends on when you're ready to submit targets, whether you can still use the old criteria to submit your targets or the new criteria. So essentially, and this shouldn't come as a surprise, our criteria update also is also valid for business ambition for 1.5 degree committed companies, right? So if you do want to submit, or you're ready to submit your interim science-based targets before this deadline of criteria version 5 coming into force, you can still use criteria version 4.2. And if you are submitting after July 2020, you have to, 2022, sorry, you have to use version 5. And in any case, you have, of course, again, the 24 months within, from your commitment to get these targets approved. Remembering what I said earlier on option 2, many of you will be aware of that. There's 2 elements, right? So this, everything I showed now is only the first element of near-term SBTs. And in addition, what you committed to is to actually have a net zero target in place. So you're actually committed to submit and get a net zero target approved 2 years from the launch, or when we start validating the net zero targets, which is January 2022. So by 2024, you should have approved net zero targets in place. And the third scenario is here is to have signed up to both option 1 and option 2. So, and this is a bit more of a bird's eye view, but again, we'd start with, do you already have approved SBTs? If yes, the question is, are they already aligned with 1.5 degree scenarios across scopes, which means, are you aligned with option 1 or not? And if you are not, you need to update your targets to be aligned with option 1 within 12 months from your commitment. If yes, great, you only need the net zero element. If you don't have 1.5 degree aligned targets, you essentially need to make sure to comply with both. I hope that makes sense. So yeah, upgrading your target to 1.5 degree alignment and submitting a net zero target and get it approved before January 2024. If you don't have approved targets yet, you again have the full 24 months of your commitment to get this target validated. And as you have committed to option 1, this target needs to be 1.5 degree aligned across all scopes, plus the net zero target again until January 24. So I hope this is not overwhelming. You can see for the net zero, the timeframes are the same as for every company, independently of whether they're part of business ambition or not. And in any case, you will have, if you've committed to option 2, have to get net zero targets by January 2024, independently of the individual target setting situation that you are in. Okay, before I close and we're going to move into Q&A, I would like to give you a short overview of the next milestones of the next few months within the initiative, essentially, because we have a lot of things coming up. The first element I've already mentioned. So we're still in the middle of finalizing the framework for net zero target setting. We are going into a second round of public consultation, which is really a final review of the criteria, guidance, and tools, which we would like to invite all of you to participate. You will find all the information on our net zero webpage within our website, and the consultation will take place from September 13th to 24th. So that's very soon. Then I also already mentioned that we'll encourage all companies that have not already to join the leading companies committed to a 1.5 degree future through the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign, to do so ahead of COP26, to join that collective group of companies committed to what is necessary. We'll also host a COP26 Climate Action Day on October 1st with many profiling and communications and amplification opportunities that will invite all Business Ambition for 1.5 degree companies to participate in. We'll provide you, if you're already committed, with more information closer to the date. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to get in touch with us. Then a major milestone, of course, is the launch of the net zero standard, which will happen the end of October, beginning of November, ahead of COP26 or at COP26. The exact date is to be confirmed. Then COP26, of course, on November 1st to 12th, which is where we will profile business ambition for 1.5-degree companies on behalf of the Science Based Targets Initiative, Women Business, and of course, the Race to Zero. And then at the end of the year, at some point in December, again, exact date to be confirmed, we will release the version 5 of the criteria, which is the reason that we convened today. And with that, I think I'm done and happy to hand back over to McKenna. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thanks, Leah. Now we have some time for questions, and I can see that the Q&A box has been very busy in the meantime while we heard from the presenters. However, before we pick up those questions, we are going to address a few frequently asked questions, which we saw asked by many attendees in the webinar registration form. So firstly, I think Leah is going to answer the question in regards to 1.5C aligned intensity pathways.
Thanks, McKenna. Yeah, happy to. So that's indeed a question that we've been receiving a lot, and which we've already also announced that the SBTi will indeed develop 1.5-degree aligned intensity pathways for all sectors that are currently covered by the sectoral decarbonization approach. Many of you will know it as the SDA tool. So industrial sectors like cement, steel, commercial buildings, transport. We will launch these sector methods throughout the next year, I'd say. Some will be already finalized at the end of 2021. Some will be launched beginning of 2022. For the time being, we already have the 1.5-degree aligned sector path for the power generation sector available, and you will definitely be informed about these updates. And we also have a sector development page on our website that gives you an update about ongoing sector development. But please note what's not on that website, actually, all the sectors that are covered by our SDA tool, such as cement, steel, commercial buildings. And so then an important part of this answer is actually that we'll also update these sectors in case you were wondering. So short answer is yes.
Perfect. Thanks, Leah. So the next frequently asked question we received was about biogenic carbon integrated into the SBTi target requirements. And just to kind of give an update, once the flag guidance, and that is forestry, land, agriculture, will come into effect, there might be some updates. However, currently, please use the guidance in regards to how we calculate biogenic carbon currently, which can be found in the target validation protocol, the corporate manual, and also the criteria. But Leah, if you could maybe answer one more question, at the very end, what are the SBTi requirements for setting scope 3 target?
Yeah, happy to. So actually today, of course, we didn't have the time to go through the standard criteria for science-based target setting, which for the most part will actually not change, right? But of course, we have extensive resources on all of this online. So on scope 3 target setting, the most important things companies need to know that the SBTi wants to see a full scope 3 screening from each company submitting targets, which means we want to see that every company has basically assessed and fully understood their scope 3 emissions, which doesn't mean the data needs to be perfect, right? But a scope 3 screening needs to have happened that shows how impactful the scope 3 emissions of that company were compared to the overall emissions of the company. So if that screening shows, or the inventory shows that the scope 3 emissions are more than 40% of the overall scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of the company needs to set a scope 3 target that is covering 2/3 of the scope 3 emissions. So what's very important to know about scope 3 is that we are generally providing more flexibility, just acknowledging the challenges around Scope 3, around data quality, around data tracking. However, we do want to enable companies with our framework to identify hotspots and feel confident to start with the target setting journey and get started reducing these emissions as well. And we do, and the flexibility in terms of Scope 3 target setting is also reflected in the fact that we have several target setting methods available, and that we also let companies combine those methods to cover the 2/3 of emissions overall. I hope that answered the question more or less.
Perfect. So next, we're going to be moving into some of the questions that were designated as to be answered live. I know some of my colleagues have been answering your questions in writing, but we did flag some that would be relevant to a large majority of the participants. So I think we'll move into those now. The first question that we received, which I will direct towards Leah, is how will the SBTi track progress by companies against their science-based targets? Is it only through CDP responses?
So the progress report that Alberto mentioned earlier was indeed the first time that we looked into progress that companies have been making. And of course, we're now moving into this decade of delivery of 2020 to 2030. We really do want to make sure that companies are delivering on their targets. And the Science-Based Targets Initiative is undergoing a project, or is in the middle of a project at the moment, to develop so-called MRV protocol, so reviewing our requirements for monitoring, reporting, and verification. So I think my answer here is watch the space. And for now, we of course already request companies to annually report on their targets, on their progress, and to do that ideally through CDP in a standardized fashion to actually enable stakeholders to effectively track companies' progress. And now that we see that more and more financial institutions and capital markets use science-based targets as indicator to assess companies' readiness, this becomes more and more important. We need standardized and trustworthy data sources which actually enable the effective construction of green finance products, etc. So this is becoming more and more important as well for policymakers and other stakeholders. So we are looking to facilitate that process globally as an initiative as well.
Perfect. So there's another question, which I think I'm going to answer myself, and it's, if we buy carbon neutral certified services from our supplier, for example, a logistics service provider, how can we reflect this reduction in our Scope 3 emissions and aligned with the SBT requirements? So from our standpoint, you are not allowed to reflect your carbon neutrality certificates, both from your company or from suppliers, as we require companies to report gross emissions to us. Specifically within the cement sector, I know that they are based in net emissions, and we do emphasize gross emissions. And in this case as well, carbon neutrality certificates are not allowed, and we do require all gross emissions, including for Scope 3, from every company. And this will be something clarified with the lead reviewer of your case once you submit your science-based targets. So another question I think which would be great to answer live, and Leah, I'm going to direct this one to you again, is there is no sector-specific guidance or SDA for my sector. Can we still set a science-based target?
Great question, and one that indeed we get a lot. So the answer generally is yes, except for the time being, if you are in the oil and gas sector, or you have a major portion of fossil fuel related activities within your value chain, which is the sector that we're currently not accepting targets for validation at the moment. For all other sectors, we are providing you with methods. So if there is indeed no sector-specific method available for your sector, which by the way is the case for many companies and sectors, you can use the absolute contraction method, which is a robust and simple target setting method, which asks companies to reduce at a linear annual rate. So it's linearly calculated, which doesn't mean that the company needs to reduce at the exact same rate every year. And this is also what the majority of approved companies have actually used, which is sometimes surprising to companies, that this is actually a widely used and very robust method that we also encourage generally to use. So many companies can, even if they have a sector-specific method that they can use, they have the choice between using the absolute contraction method and the sector-specific method, except the power generation sector, which needs to use the sector-specific method. And we do have some other sector-specific requirements, but the overall answer is almost every company can use the absolute contraction method, and that's a good thing.
Perfect. So another question that I think would be great to clarify for everybody is, if you sign up to the Science Based Targets Initiative, are you automatically signing up to net zero, or does it depend on whether you sign up to option 2 or not?
So this depends whether you joining the Science Based Targets Initiative through the standard commitment letter, which we still have as well on our website, or the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree commitment letter. Only the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree commitment letter that I showed earlier includes a part for a net zero target setting commitment currently. So I would say the answer is it depends. For standard commitment letter, no. For Business Ambition, again, it depends. For option 1, this is only focused on the near-term portion of science-based target setting. As said, 1.5 degree alignment across scopes. And option 2 includes both an interim target as well as a long-term net zero target. So only those companies that signed option 2 in the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree commitment letter have committed currently to setting a net zero target.
Perfect. So on the theme of net zero, I think another question that would be great to answer live is, what are the expectations to accepting carbon credits in the future? Will carbon credits be accepted as a lever towards zero emissions?
So this actually is a question that for the first time basically became part of the Science Based Targets Initiative discourse with the launch of the development process of net zero, right? Because the near-term science-based targets are not, have not accepted offsets, and we will continue to not include offsets, and we have to be careful with the terminology, of course, but for near-term science-based targets, no compensation or neutralization is accepted to achieve the targets. For the net zero targets, however, we define an end state of achieving this balance of no net accumulation that a company causes through anthropogenic emissions versus basically the capacity of the planet to absorb these emissions. So to reach that state of emissions, we do expect companies to neutralize their residual emissions with credible and permanent carbon removals. This is an ongoing process. It's also a scientific process that not only the Science Based Targets Initiative is involved in, and there's still lack of clarity on some elements. What we do know is the necessary level of actually emissions reduction. So that's what we're focusing on in the launch of the net zero framework. But yes, the overall element of purchasing credits, of market-based solutions that are on the long run supposed to be based on carbon removals instead of compensation or avoidance or reduction projects, will be an important element of the net zero framework and discussion overall, I would say. But for the time being, and for the topic of this webinar today, they have never been accepted and are still not being accepted for near-term SBTs.
Perfect. And I think we have time for one more question. So this question again is related to business ambition for 1.5. And someone would like to know, how does the business ambition for 1.5 link to the race to zero?
Great. Yeah, the Business Ambition for 1.5 Degree campaign is an official partner of Race to Zero. So it is a route to join. It's also the recommended route to join. So we're working very closely with Race to Zero to enable companies to make a robust commitment to a science-based pathway through the Science Based Targets initiative. But again, overall then being also represented under this umbrella initiative that the Race to Zero initiative is, and maybe I'll just spend 1 minute on explaining what the Race to Zero actually is. So it was founded by the high-level climate action champions, Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Munoz, as the non-state actor umbrella campaign. So of course at COP26 we have the state portion and we have the non-state portion of climate action, and the Race to Zero is the largest ever basically conglomerate campaign uniting stakeholders, so that's also citizens, investors, but of course also the corporate sector, that are all committed to doing what is necessary on their own to achieve net zero emissions and basically join this Race to Zero in order to make the 1.5 degree future reality. And this will be the flagship campaign uniting all of these committed actors at COP26. So if you do join the campaign before September 30th, you will be part of Race to Zero, you will be a member company, and also added to the Race to Zero and partner websites.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Leah. And I think on that note, before we close today's webinar, again, we would like to take the opportunity to invite all companies to join the Business Ambition for 1.5C in the global race to zero ahead of COP26. As mentioned, you can do so by signing that Business Ambition for 1.5C commitment letter ahead of September 30, which is our cutoff date for companies to be included in our communications around COP26 and also to be profiled as part of our Race to Zero campaign. You will find a lot of guidance online, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions about the commitment to us. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be shared with all of you over email. And we just want to thank you so much for joining the discussion today. And we really look forward to working with you in the run up to COP26 and hope that you join us in raising your climate ambition. If you have any further questions, please take a look at our website to see if it is answered in our frequently asked questions. And alternatively, you can reach out to the info@science-based-targets email for specific company questions. In the meantime, thank you so much for your attendance. And thank you to Leah and Alberto and the rest of the Science Based Targets Initiative team. And we will see you guys next time.
Thank you very much.